In November of 2020, my family and I were out of town visiting other family for the Thanksgiving holiday, and one day I started to have this weird tingling sensation in my jaw. The next day, that sensation had progressed to a full-blown earache. And then that earache, it didn't go away. For the next 6 years, I would struggle with some kind of TMJ pain, but that first year, 2021, was the worst year of my life. Every single day, I had these intense earaches. Every single day, I'd wake up, I'd feel good, but I knew at some point in the day, I'm going to be in extreme pain. So I would go to work. I'd go to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, but other than that, I pretty much stayed home in my bed or on the couch, just trying to find something to help the pain go away. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever been so miserable, been suffering so much that you just couldn't do anything? You felt like quitting. You felt like you couldn't go on. Your social life was gone. Maybe you've been there too. You have some kind of a physical pain like me, or maybe it's an emotional pain, some kind of a grief or a disappointment that you have desperately pleaded to God to take away from you, but He hasn't. But what if the pain that you're so desperate to get rid of is actually something that God has intentionally given you to get your attention? Over these last 6 years, I've learned something about my suffering, and it has completely changed the way that I view my pain. And I learned it from a man who has suffered far more than I ever have, from the Apostle Paul. So if you're exhausted, discouraged, wondering, will this pain ever go away? I want to share with you what I've learned from Paul. I want to share with you my hope for tomorrow, even when I know the pain, it's not going to go away. So I have right here a grocery bag, and it's a normal white grocery bag, but you can tell there's something inside of it. So you're not interested at all in the grocery bag. You're actually interested with what's inside of it. Well, in the biblical times, they didn't have the grocery bags, of course, but they did have clay jars, just cheap containers. Nobody cared about the jar. It was what was inside that was so important. And that's what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Listen to what he had to say about these clay jars. We have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So pain, it shows how weak and vulnerable you are. You're like the clay jar or the grocery bag. And that's what's so important. That's what's so good about it, because your pain actually reveals the treasure that is inside of you. But we're tempted to think, God, if you would just please take this pain away from me, I could do so much more. I would be so free from this suffering, from this daily struggle. God, I could do anything. I could accomplish so much if I didn't have this pain. Now, let's say I didn't have the grocery bag, but I used a different container, something nicer, something like this. Well, now you're actually a little more interested in the container. It looks a lot better than just a plastic bag. You're still curious what's inside of it, of course, but your attention's a little more divided. You're not simply ignoring the container. It's so important for us to realize how valuable our pain and our suffering is, because the more impressive we are, the less impressive God seems. But don't worry, suffering is never the end of the Christian story. Listen to what Paul has to say about suffering, and listen to these 4 different ways and see which one speaks to where you are right now. So the first type of suffering that Paul mentions in verse 8 is, he says, we are afflicted in every way. So an affliction it's some kind of a pressure or this heavy weight that's come upon us. A life situation where we just feel severely burdened from. Maybe you're experiencing some kind of brokenness in your family or in your marriage. Your relationship is fractured. It's not where you want it to be, and it just weighs you down. You're afflicted. The second way of suffering he mentions there in verse 8, he says perplexed. Perplexed is just simply not understanding. It's the classic why question. God, why is this happening to me? God, why am I in so much pain? Why are you not taking this away from me? Why are you allowing me to go through this suffering every single day? You simply don't understand. That's what it means to be perplexed. The third type of suffering he mentions in verse 9 is persecuted. Uh, Persecution, it's like being hunted or being pursued. So you imagine maybe you're experiencing at work somebody who is just seemingly out to get you. They're trying to ruin your career. They're trying to ruin your life. Maybe that's the kind of suffering that you're experiencing. And the fourth type of suffering he mentions there in verse 9 is struck down. To be struck down is simply to be knocked down. You imagine in a boxing match, they're trying to strike down one another. They're trying to knock each other out. And so we get this idea that we experience some kind of a suffering that just takes us out. Some kind of a tragedy in our life where we are just completely overwhelmed and we just can't keep functioning. We don't feel like we can continue on. That's what it means to be struck down. So Paul, he mentions those four kinds of sufferings: afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, and struck down. And he doesn't just mention those and leaves us alone to wallow in our misery, to just say, hey, you've got a problem. That's all there is to it. No, he does something amazing with those. He shows us this glorious end result of each of those sufferings. But look back at verses 8 and 9 at what he says. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. So thinking about those end results, for the Christian, pain will not have the last word. But how do you not lose heart when you're in pain and when you're suffering? How exactly are you supposed to go on? Now, it's kind of ironic, but Paul, he describes our pain, our suffering, as light and momentary, and it kind of feels like a slap in the face. I don't know about you, but for these 6 years, my pain has not felt light, and it hasn't seemed like it's lasted just a moment. Every day is hard. Every day is filled with suffering. So what exactly is Paul talking about? How can he describe this as light and momentary? Now, Paul, he's not trying to tell you that your pain is temporary or it's not that big of a deal. You just need to get over it. No, what Paul is doing is he's trying to give us the right perspective of pain, and he's trying to help us to keep pain in view of eternity. Now, think about Paul's life. In 2 Corinthians 11, it describes just how much suffering Paul has experienced. Now, we don't know the exact dates, but maybe Paul's around 60 years old when he writes this letter to the Corinthians. And we think he died around 62 AD. So for Paul, he's calling his suffering that he's experienced in his life, potentially 60 years, he's called this a light and momentary affliction. How can he say that? I mean, I've been suffering for 6 years. I can't imagine 10 times that. So how can that be a light and momentary affliction? Well, imagine Paul's life in the perspective of eternity. So Paul, he suffered 60 years on the earth. How long has it been since he's passed away? It's been nearly 2,000 years. So in the perspective of eternity, those 60 years of his life is very light and momentary. And Paul has experienced nearly 2,000 years of complete freedom from any pain, from any suffering. So you can see how for Paul, he can have that perspective, because for the rest of eternity, he knows he will not suffer. He will be able to enjoy God's presence forever. So for the believer, pain is short. Let me encourage you, one day your pain will end. One day, my pain, it will end. But pain, it screams for your attention. Even though we know the greater purpose behind it, it's hard not to be distracted by it. So don't be distracted by your pain. Instead, let it remind you of the greater treasure within you. Let your pain help you see how you're the plastic bag, and let it remind you of that treasure that's within it. Let it remind you of Christ. Because through Christ, that's where we will be sustained. That's where we will not be crushed. We won't be destroyed, but where we can endure. That's only through Christ. You see, Jesus, he suffered for you. He gave up his life on the cross so that you could confess your sins and you could put your faith in him, so that one day you would know that your pain will end. You have eternity to look forward to because of Christ. No pain is ever going to be able to remotely compare to the glory that we're going to share in our resurrection with Christ. Because you have experienced pain, how much more wonderful is that freedom going to be? How much sweeter is that freedom from all pain and suffering going to taste when you're with Christ in eternity? So suffering in faith prepares us for an eternal weight of glory. We have to focus on Christ because in our pain, so much good is accomplished. God is glorified. So may God distract us from ourselves and distract us to this incredible and valuable treasure that is within us, our plastic bags, the treasure of Jesus Christ.